Hello and welcome to this hour's news review. Well, the Western Military Alliance, NATO, will open a liaison office in the Japanese capital, Tokyo, next year, despite warnings against its expansion into Asia. Japanese media report that the military alliance will use the office as a hub for cooperation with South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. NATO's plan was also announced by the Japanese ambassador to the U.S. in May. Koji Tomita said the office will be set up to facilitate consultations in the region. The announcement comes amid growing military cooperation between China and Russia in the Asia-Pacific. Beijing warned against the plan when it was first reported. Opening an office in Tokyo, however, is facing a major obstacle as France, a key NATO member, is pushing back against it. President Emmanuel Macron has said the move would be a big mistake. I'd like to welcome my guests to this news review. Matthew Ehret, Senior Fellow from the American University in Moscow and Montreal, and Christopher Hilali, researcher and political analyst out of Vermont. Thank you both for being with me. Well, let's start this off with our first guest. Looking at out of Montreal, looking at the situation that with this Western alliance, now NATO, expanding to the Far East, why do you think that they're doing this at this time, Matthew? What does, well, we'll say the United States because it's leading the pack here. What is it trying to accomplish?
Well, they're trying to revive and hold on to an obsolete doctrine of global governance that they believed was the only path forward after 1992 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which posited a one world controlled under Anglo-American military hegemony, supremacy, and the fact that China and especially Russia together have created an alliance that has provided a new framework as far as providing an alternative security and economic platform for the world that any nation of the world is permitted to join. This very open system has resulted in a massive insecurity, and thus there has been a doubling down of a military encirclement program that was unleashed in the 90s with the expansion of NATO around Russia's perimeter, and now with the NATO of the Pacific, as well as the expansion of the Five Eyes program into the Pacific around China. That's also what's happening there too.
Christopher, what about the aspect of this that Macron is saying this is a mistake? What is that about? What has happened this time around that the French president actually is disagreeing with this?
Well, as we remember, just a few months ago, Macron went to Beijing, and there was a lot of high-level talks between France and China about relations and about hopefully easing tensions. And so Macron was a welcome guest in Beijing. And so I think part of that has been a sort of tour to try to not only orient Europe, France itself, but also European policy as a middle ground, as a bridge between the United States and China. Of course, France recognizes China as a major partner in investments, in business, in trade. So they understand, and I think Macron understands, that the opening of an office in Tokyo, in Japan, that committed heinous war crimes and genocide against the Chinese people during World War II, which it has still not fully accounted for, is a great escalation, especially with what's going on in Europe and how NATO has been encircling not only Russia, but also with the United States at the forefront encircling China. So this is a great provocation, and I think France is recognizing that if we provoke China too much, it will ripple into the economic realm, into the cultural realm, and create maybe social instability even in France and in other European countries. They don't want that.
Interesting point. But Matthew, wouldn't the United States also understand that actually putting that kind of pressure on China, the type of effects that it could have globally? Yes, the United States is far from Europe, but their biggest trade partner is also China. So why doesn't the U.S. also look at this from a strategic perspective?
Well, I think, as Lavrov had said, we hope that our American partners can sober up and we can have an honest conversation about the future soon. But the current leadership, I think, was correct of Russia in treating the United States as a bit of a drunken basket case at the moment that has very much lost touch of its own self-interest. And it would really, it's true, from a rational, sane perspective, you're totally right. There would be no reason to risk the unleashing of what could be a thermonuclear war with immense amount of damage. And there is only to gain by working economically with the greatest growth machine in the world, China, and other nations that want to have a development-oriented future of cooperation. There's actually much more business that could be done with peace than in war. But that is not really well understood by the current governing class that rather sees benefit on a temporary level of supplying a lot of contracts to militarists in Japan that have already changed their pacifist constitution, giving Japan the right now for the first time since World War II to have a war in defense of allies. That's very dangerous. And purchasing a lot of equipment like Tomahawk missiles and other hypersonics are being built and purchased by the U.S. By the Japanese and their U.S. Handlers in preparation for any type of assault on China.
And Christopher, where do you see this going? Because as Matthew talked about, as far as those in power, or at least the ruling class in the United States, that it just continues to get worse and worse. Your perspective of where this is going?
Well, I think from what we've seen over the past years, NATO's program of expansion, and particularly its partnership program, which not only is in Asia and Europe, but also in Latin America. Colombia is a partner of NATO. And Colombia, before, of course, the recent election, was very close to the NATO alliance and using that as a sort of launching pad for covert operations against Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So I think that what we can see here is that NATO's expansion will continue unabated until it is met with a force. And that force right now is in Ukraine with Russia fighting against really the Euro-Atlantic alliance. And now in China over Taiwan and even on the Korean Peninsula. The dangerous part is that I foresee the escalations, and the problem is that I don't really see any other options besides war unless diplomacy is really taken seriously. As Matthew rightly stated, following Lavrov's statement, everyone needs to sober up here, especially all the European partners and the United States, and really come to terms with a new global reality. If it doesn't come to terms with the developing multipolar world order, then I'm afraid we're going to have conflicts that are going to make Ukraine look like child's play. And that's the dangerous part.
Indeed. Well, on that note, I appreciate both of you being with me on this news review. Matthew Ehret, a senior fellow, American University Moscow, out of Montreal, and Christopher Hilali, research and political analyst out of Vermont, Vermont. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another news review.